Phyllis, I give you Benjamin Marks.
Thanks. Thanks, Ron. So just touching on what he said, I wasn't going to mention it, but yeah, I run a lot of sites for people who are still alive, who used to be radical free market advocates, but who are not anymore. And so I try to remind them of their own words. And so, yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the people whose work I've dug up and made available are either no longer active, or they were no longer active for a long time and then they died. But only two exceptions to that, Viv Forbes and Ron Manners. And Mannkal is the most radical free market organisation in Australia. And so we can't take it for granted. Now, topic, communicating ideas to free market ideas to a hostile audience. Unless you're preaching to the converted, all critics of the free market are hostile, because they're not merely saying, we want you to run your business differently or sell this product instead of that product. They want to forcibly confiscate your property, your freedoms. I mean, that's pretty hostile. So we're up against, really hostile critics. And so I thought I'd just go through 3 simple techniques for responding to hostile critics. They're kind of shortcuts or cheats. And it's not to say there aren't other ways, but just I thought 3 is a good. These 3 are simple, good, and easy to remember. So one is to flip them, to listen to what they say, and give them a taste of their own medicine. Hoist them on their own petard, make them shove their words back in their mouth. So Bert Kelly, that was his main technique. Quoting one Malcolm Fraser speech and then quoting another Malcolm Fraser speech. And so, he'd say that Malcolm Fraser must have 2 different speech writers, and they must have had a big fight because they're not talking to each other. He'd read from a speech and someone was saying how bad government intervention is, but then how good government interference is here. And he says, oh, well, there must be a difference between government intervention and government interference, and he regrets not learning that at uni. So a common way to flip an argument, so people say, show me an example of where it works, your ideas for getting government out of this industry or this area or out of society altogether. So, you can give them examples. Case studies talk about the history of Europe, Somalia, Iceland, US before, Declaration of Independence, whatever you want. But they'll often come back with counter-examples, say, but what about this and that? So I find it's better just to say, well, show me an example of where, in modern society today, large-scale example, of where there's no theft and murder. And they can't show you an example. So then you say, well, aren't you impractical in opposing theft and murder, since there's no large-scale example today of where there's no theft and murder? And so their argument against free market advocates is essentially that it's impractical simply because the world's imperfect, and that's not the way it is today. So it's just, if it's not the status quo, it must be wrong. That's what their argument amounts to. So just flip them. Another example is they say there should be government intervention, in this important area. And then you say, okay, fair enough, but if government intervention is good in this important area, why not in all these unimportant areas too? So it's kind of a simple general way, and you don't need to get bogged down in history or bogged down in empirical analysis or whatever. It's not to say there isn't a place for that, but in a lot of occasions, being quick is the thing to do, and if it's a hostile audience, then probably won't stay around for long. The second simple technique I thought I'd talk about, and this is the best one, the best way to deal with a hostile audience is to outnumber them. So, I'll just let you know. So that sounds simple, and I wish it was. But there are ways you can outnumber them quite easily. For example, if there's anyone who's not a free market advocate here, they'd be outnumbered. And so, they'd have to start really analysing their thoughts. But also, just like a one-on-one conversation. I mean, 50% of Australia are not free market advocates. So if you can single out someone, have a conversation with them, that gives like a false reality that there's actually 50% of the people in a conversation are free market advocates. So, that's kind of simple, but it's true. Another example is like branch stacking, obviously, and another example could be like if this group, like if we get to know each other a bit better, and maybe you all know each other better than you know me, but you could look at other groups' events, like, is there a Labour Party meeting, is there a Tim Flannery talk, or education minister talk, and pretend you don't know each other, scatter around. And so there's a great example that Murray Rothbard did in I think the 50s or the 60s with his group called the Bastiat Circle. And Murray Rothbard was an Austrian economist in the US, and real radical free market advocates, people like Ron, and Ron knew them anyway. But so they'd go. So there's an example. They went to a debate on education policy, and both sides wanted government to intervene in education, obviously. And so when it came to question time, they all put their hands up, and one of them was chosen. They said, they think it's outrageous. Surely you can't really believe that government should have anything to do with education. And of course, people on stage are shocked, like, what this? And then, next question, same thing. And then, uproar, heckling. So, and then, so we could have an event like that, and then afterwards have our own event or go out to drinks or something. So that's strategic, punching above our weight. And I guess the only risk is that, we become convinced that they're telling the truth. So, but stuff, if someone's, anyway. And the third example I want to talk about is that a lot of people, they get bought out. They see where their handouts are coming from. That's what they support. So what we've got to do is give out better handouts. And I've got some handouts here. I'll just take one. Run it around. So it's just a bit of fun. But what I've done on economics.org.au and Gina Rinehart.info, Hancock.info, whatever, is dig up a lot of really radical history, made it all available for free. It's as expensive or cheaper than any of our enemies' stuff, and there's no one else doing it. Like, if you all wanted to, do research in your own areas, you'll find, amazing amounts of stuff. Like, before I started putting up Lang Hancock stuff, the only item online featuring Lang Hancock's own words was that video of him out of context, defending or saying that we should sterilize Aborigines by poisoning their water holes, which was just talking about that's what the welfare state does. But anyway, that was it. So Lang Hancock, his family have a lot of money, a lot of supporters. That was it. You search Lang Hancock online, that's all you found before I started putting up stuff. So now there's only over 80 items. I've found really radical letters to the editor. Like, I found one just a few weeks ago, a letter to the editor in the Australian in '84, and he put forward his 2 rules for if a politician wants his support, they've got to promise to do 2 things and do 2 things. They've got to pass no more laws of any kind in either house, and repeal legislation in the order of the last to come, the first to go, so as to avoid any silly discussions about what laws, if any, should remain. So that's really radical, and it's not like it's someone like me saying it. It's Lang Hancock saying it. This is his own words, and it's not private correspondence. Like, I put up some private correspondence with Margaret Thatcher. Anyway, this isn't private correspondence. This is to the Australian, And another example is John Singleton. Ron tells me he's not that well known in Western Australia, but in the eastern states he's like the #1 figure, and he was a big force behind the Workers' Party. But even some Workers' Party directors told me that, John Singleton wasn't the real deal, that Bob Howard ghost wrote his stuff. But after a hell of a lot of research, I found that he wrote columns before the Workers' Party, really radical columns in advertising news, newspaper news, which I've put up. You can find it on johnsingleton.info. Really radical stuff, saying we need a new political party, Liberal. This is even before he did the '74 Liberal Party campaign, where he painted Labor as socialist, even though Liberal were also socialist, and so he had some support in the Liberal Party, but it all frittered away pretty quickly because they saw that it was dishonest, and like Snedden basically admitted that he's a socialist too. Anyway, and John Singleton's a major figure. So like on Mrs. Rinehart's book, there's a whole lot of really senior people giving endorsements and testimonials, but there's only one endorsement on the cover of the book, and that's John Singleton. So he's still around, and Ron and I are working on him. One of the things, so the Workers' Party, really radical. Like they make, Mrs. Rinehart look like a moderate, and like really, like I'm not just saying it to be funny. Like, their taxation policy was taxation is theft. So so John Singleton's a really big figure, and had a huge number of other really big figures associated with it, including Maxwell Newton, the first editor of The Australian, and the first editor of the daily version of the Fin Review. So the first editor of our only 2 national newspapers was economic spokesman for the Workers' Party. Like, these are big-time people, and especially now, newspapers talk about how their reputation is why they will survive. Their reputation for quality journalism and all that stuff. So what have they done to show their respect for their reputation? People like Maxwell Newton. How much Maxwell Newton material have they dug up, republished? Zero. And so I've dug up quite a bit, and he was really radical. Like, his philosophy was if he's not sued for defamation once a year, he must be losing his touch. I think through Maxwell Newton, it's a way to get to Rupert Murdoch too, because at The Australian they were known as the odd couple, Murdoch the publisher, Newton the editor, and they had a massive falling out, but they were always so Murdoch was a defender of tariffs at the beginning, as Newton was a great opponent. And so they had a big falling out, and Maxwell Newton, huge invective against Murdoch, like bigger than any left-wing person has ever done against Murdoch, from Maxwell Newton, saying that the only reason he's now criticising Whitlam is because Whitlam got rid of the honours system, so because Rupert can no longer be made Sir, that's why he's going after Whitlam. But anyway, they reconciled, publicly in 1980, after being the #1 Murdoch critic, and he was made finance editor of Murdoch's New York Post, and although they agreed that they were difficult personalities back then, it was also agreed that Murdoch's economics was wrong back then. So if he was wrong on, if he's been wrong once because of Maxwell Newton, we can look at where else Maxwell Newton is radical and say, maybe Murdoch should be more radical there too. And so I was saying, no one's done any research on Maxwell Newton. About a year ago, I was contacted by a CBS documentary company saying they'd like to interview Maxwell Newton for a documentary on Rupert Murdoch, big documentary. And so I call people I dig up work. So I call Maxwell Newton a staff member of mine because I employ his work. Anyway, so I responded to the documentary company saying, I'm sorry, but Maxwell Newton died 21 years ago, but when I see him, I'll tell him. So there's, it's like there's nothing. So there's so much research still to be done. Another example of, like a guy called Hans Thalstrup, great adventurer, a great friend of Neville Kennard. I don't know if you guys remember the Dick Smith stunts from the 70s, where like they towed an iceberg into Sydney Harbour, or a double-decker bus jumped over motorcycles to parody the Evel Knievel stuff. Anyway, so Hans Thalstrup was central to those. He was also a great adventurer. Circumnavigated Australia in a tinny, and when he was asked, how'd you navigate? He said, I just kept Australia to the left. And he's set records for like going across Australia on 1 tank of petrol, very slowly, very strategically. He's also raced at Bathurst, and he made the world's first solar car, and the World Solar Car Challenge he founded. That gets media attention every year. Anyway, his politics are like running, or even more radical. Like you might think it's silly, but it's really brave and impressive. Like, he refuses to get a Medicare card, all right? So, and he has farmland in northern Queensland, and it was affected by the floods, but he refused to accept the subsidy the government offered. But because he didn't accept it, that meant he had to pay the 2%, 5% tax. So he paid money so that he wouldn't receive government money. He wants to live his whole life without receiving government money. Like, that's really impressive achievement. Anyway, he should be more famous, and he kind of is famous among those who know his stunts and all his records. And it was only a small percentage of those that I mentioned. But I put up an article of his, and a lady contacts me, and it turns out it's his daughter that he never knew he had. So these people, they've got like no media presence, but they deserve to. And Dick Smith is like great friends with him. Dick Smith's famous, and Neville Kennard, good friends with him. So there's a hell of a lot of research still to be done, and research is a way of going back to flipping people's own words against them.